So, Joe, Isadora's Children, what did you think?
It took me a little while to work out what this film was doing. It starts off with some title cards with a date on it, and then a young girl reading a memoir by Isadora Duncan. And I started to wonder to begin with whether these dates were arbitrary or intriguing, because it would say, for example, October 23, and all we'd see is that she's on a train reading a book. And then it would cut to another day. And I started to think, is this being put together in a very deliberate, purposeful way, or is it just sort of random bits and pieces? And then you see her first rehearsal, and there's an extreme close up of the back of her hand pressed against the floorboards, and then her feet just behind it. And I had this strange feeling that of like choreography, understanding the film's choreography. And in that moment, the very quiet, patient sequences that preceded this first rehearsal sort of slotted into place. And I began to feel that the film is being very deliberately choreographed. And it was in that moment that I started to really trust the film and really went with it. And when she finally gives the dance, it's very, or when we see like a full rehearsal, it's this slow, patient, methodical sort of coming to terms with the gestures. It's like she's finding the dance. And that's echoed later on when one of the characters, I can't remember if they read aloud or just write down something from Isadora Duncan's memoir, when she says something like, "Yeah, I didn't invent the dance, I found it. The dance was there long before I was."
Mm.
And so there's a very carefully judged and and really well executed sense of balance, a kind of calling back and forth across the film, with certain points echoing one another later in the text, but done so carefully and with such a lightness of touch that it would be very easy to miss it. And I thought in this first story, I thought a few things. Firstly, I thought how kind of beautiful and moving it is to watch someone absorbed by something, someone studying. There's a kind of melancholy fascination with this dance and with the story behind it. And it's just a fragment of this woman's life. In fact, all three of the stories capture a moment in a character's life when, for whatever reason, they are momentarily absorbed by this particular story. And we don't get any backstory, we don't even get any names. It's just this one moment. And I really liked that. I liked that it didn't feel compelled to give us any kind of background or any sort of psychological structures beyond their fascination with this dance and with Isadora Duncan's grief after her children, and the way that art finally enabled her to kind of, if not come to terms with it, at least express it in a way that was meaningful for her. So we follow this woman for a while, and then without any fuss at all, the film cuts to a different story with another woman rehearsing this dance. And then after a time, it cuts to a third story. And there is this structure of like a bifurcated narrative with different characters, following different characters' points of view. This is not an unfamiliar structure. And yet it was done so simply in this film that it felt original, even audacious, but again, in a very quiet way. And I began to feel, particularly when it switched to the third story, that I really hope it doesn't do a kind of obvious tying together of all the loose threads, because it just wasn't that kind of film, and it didn't. And so I think the structure worked beautifully for this film. And then finally, you get to the end of the last story. And the first two dances we see of those younger women, those two dances are performances, or they're expressions or symbols of the grief which inspired the dance. And this third performance isn't a performance at all. I began to, when she closes the curtain and she moves her hand down the curtain, I thought, my God, she's dancing. And then I realized that the film's payoff, the film's revelation, and it is revelatory, is that the film has changed the language, that this woman is not dancing per se, but that her every gesture is suddenly freighted with meaning in a way that I found astonishing. It was like I was watching a dance, but she wasn't dancing. It was like her being, her every gesture was transcendent. And the third, it was I think it had the power and impact it did, because very subtly the film becomes more intimate and personal and private than it has with the other stories. You know, we have a shot of this woman sitting alone in her house and walking back to her house very, very slowly. She walks with a cane. And so there is that sort of loneliness. There's also, she lights some incense by a photograph of a child, which suggests that maybe she too has lost a child, but it doesn't delve into that. And so that end sequence I thought was astonishing, as moving as anything I've seen for a really long time. And I think it's a powerfully innovative and daring film, but done so simply and so quietly that it was, I mean, I really admired that. It would have been easy to draw attention to just how daring and innovative it's being, and yet it doesn't. It just lets it all play out in a very calm and patient and methodical way. And I was astonished by it.
I actually agree with everything that you say, but I think I did have a slightly different experience of this film. I mean, on this being a film about dance, about movement, I really agree with you. You know, we were talking recently about becoming hyper aware of sound in a film, and like really hearing every sound, you know, every rustle of a leaf or drop of water. I found that this film really sensitized me to every single movement. I really agree with that. And there's a point, I think, in the first act where she's reading from the book, and oh no, sorry, it's the teacher in the second part that says to the student that every gesture has a meaning. And I really like this idea that, you know, no gesture is wasted. Just as an aside, a few years ago, I was in London with a friend, and we were just watching people walking along the banks of the Thames. And I was commenting to this person about, when you really look at every person's movement, you know, there's so much movement. And if you kind of think that every gesture people make is important, it becomes kind of overwhelming at the amount of gestures that there are when you're looking at a crowd of people. And I saw a guy move his arm up like this for no apparent reason. And it's always stuck with me. And I don't know how, but at some point I want to use this gesture in my work. So, you know, when that, I really liked that about this film, that it did make, it felt like one of the theses of this film, as you say, in each of the three stories, is that every gesture is important. You know, obviously the first two stories, it's explicitly about dance, about deliberate kind of movement with awareness. But the third story is so interesting from the perspective that, because our senses are so heightened to watching the movement and watching every gesture, that when she closes the curtain, as you say, when she gets undressed, I found that a very powerful scene. You know, when she's walking down the street, I mean, it's like it's a study of movement with an aging body. You know, the way she struggles down the street. I really agree that was very successful. And the other thing I really liked about the film, which you also picked up, was kind of portraying this process of being inspired, you know, being lost in discovery, especially in that first story when she goes to the library, and, you know, the joy of taking big art books off the shelf and kind of flicking through them, and the sound of the pages turning, and, you know, these beautiful impractical art books that you know, so it kind of, I enjoyed seeing that process, because I love that process myself, when you just, you start following a trail, you know, and it felt like this wasn't just any old trail. She was reading the book, and it's like an artist's work living on, and you know that future generations can re-experience something of the joy of kind of that process, you know, being passed on from the artist to other people at a later point. So that I really enjoyed as well. I think I had more problems with this film than you did. I think right from the very beginning, when it was telling you a little bit of the story of Isadora Duncan, which, you know, we've talked a bit recently about statements at the beginning of a film, and I think this was fine. I think it was helpful to know the story of Isadora Duncan because I didn't know it. But the one thing I did that threw me off was it referred to Isadora Duncan as mythical.
Yeah, I picked up on that. Yeah,
she
wasn't mythical. She was real.
She was real, yeah. And so I actually stopped it because I was thinking, oh, maybe in French, mythical, you know, means something. It has a broader meaning, but it doesn't, you know. And so it's like, I don't know. That was just unfortunate that threw me off, and then that made me suspicious of the dates, because I wasn't sure whether the dates had any meaning, like you. But I think possibly because I'd been thrown off by mythical, I wasn't that patient with the dates. And actually, looking back over the whole film, I don't feel that the dates had anything. You know, you were looking at something I'd produced recently, and I'd put, they were sessions talking with someone, and I'd kind of started each session by saying session 1 and giving the date, you know, and you suggested that I didn't have that. And I think it was a right suggestion. And I think, you know, there's no problem in putting the dates in, but they have to have a purpose. And I didn't really feel that they did. In some ways, I loved the documenting of the first woman's kind of process of being inspired, and you know, that discovering Isadora's work and reliving it. But I felt that we weren't able to share in it. It was so, and I think this is the same in all the stories really, that it was really a film where the experiences were quite personal to the people involved. You know, I think there was a kind of detachment. We weren't really allowed into her enjoyment, her experience. And, you know, there was something, I mean, and maybe this is, I think, I agree with you that everything about this film is probably deliberate. You know, the director is a choreographer, isn't he? And so, you know, the film, I trust that the film is choreographed in the way that he wanted to. So he obviously intended this, but I think the film is really about, it's so lonely, it's so empty. You know, all of the studios that they're in, and all of the, apart from in the performance in the second act, everywhere they go it's empty. You know, they sit in the cafeteria and there's absolutely no one in there. And you know, there's a real emptiness. In the first story, we're in the flat of the main character, and we kind of see a person that may be her partner, but smoking at a window. But we, you know, it's like we're not in on their lives. And I found that kind of detachment sad, I guess. You know, maybe that was the intention. But one thing I really had a problem with in this film was it felt like it was a little bit too manipulative, because there is this detachment from the film. It's like I felt that when the music gets loud, that's when I'm supposed to feel emotion. It's like it felt like the film was being a little bit manipulative, that at the point when the piano music gets very loud, that's the point to feel emotion. And that really didn't work for me. That felt really contrived. As you said, everything about this film and what does make this film successful is very subtle, very quiet. And I just felt that was a little bit out of keeping with it. The second act, I wasn't convinced at all by. You know, I think the first and third acts, although I've raised the point about kind of feeling detached from them, I think it was a kind of documenting of a person having a very profound experience, and the experience was happening inside them. And there's something quite clever about that, about portraying it through the movement as much as anything. The second act I found a bit problematic in the sense that we had conversation between the teacher and the student. And I just didn't find that convincing, really. It felt like the teacher was trying to tell the student what experience she was having. I didn't actually feel convinced that the student was having that experience herself. And I thought it was really interesting that we didn't actually see her performance. That instead we were shown the faces of the audience, who were all looking very earnest and very, you know, again, it just felt a little bit contrived. I mean, it obviously provided a nice pathway through to the third story, that, you know, we ended on this, seeing this woman crying, and then she became the person in the third act. But yeah, I wasn't convinced by that. And I do think that the third act is so different than the first two that it doesn't feel like it's really part of the same film. I do think that, you know, the first act and the third act are both fascinating, but I don't know that they really sit together in one film, you know, kind of threaded together by these dates, as if they do have some connection. So I think on the whole, I enjoyed it. You know, it's definitely worth seeing. It is successful, this film, in many ways, but it did leave me with some of these problems, thinking about some of these issues. I think in the end, you know, I mean, I feel a bit dissatisfied by the element of detachment from their experience, but, you know, maybe that is what the film's about. It is about grief. It's about, you know, also there's another quote from Isadora's book when she's talking about that the event is so horrible that she can't find any beauty in it. And, you know, and I think maybe that's in this film, because she still makes enduring art. You know, she still makes art that can be passed down and that people can experience and, I was going to say enjoy, but not necessarily enjoy, because I think in some ways this is a film about documenting emptiness, documenting sadness. And so it was, I guess it was very successful in that. Maybe I just found it a little bit too, what would be the word? Contrived, I guess, you know. But on the whole, I did, you know, all of the things you appreciated about it, I did appreciate it. It's a really worthwhile film to watch. And yeah, I enjoyed it.
But far more equivocal than me. I would come back to a couple of things. Firstly, I agree with you. That title card at the beginning is unfortunate. And I made note of that because I didn't know if it was badly written or badly translated. Because aside from the Isadora Duncan was a mythical dancer, it then says something like Isadora Duncan was behind modern dance. And I know what they mean by that, but that doesn't make sense. And that's really unfortunate, because it had exactly the same effect on me as it did on you, was when those dates came up and I started to think, intentional or just arbitrary? Now, I think the dates go to the heart of this film. And I think when we first see her rehearsal and the dates kind of clicked into place to me, that's at the end of the film, I realized that the point of those dates are like dance steps. And to ask why that date is a bit like asking why raise your right arm at that point. the film is kind of changing the language, but it's using things that are not dance as dance. When I make that comment, and while I was making these notes, I was very aware that I was, for whatever reason, very receptive to this film. And we often come back to this, don't we? That if you're watching something that does not sort of correspond to the very conventional beats of, you know, film as entertainment, then it depends very much on how open and receptive we are to it.
Yeah.
But what I really appreciated about this film is that it builds a sense of unity that has nothing to do with narrative. You know, it doesn't build psychological structures or narrative structures in any conventional sense. And in that way, it is very risky, you know, because because it doesn't build a sense of meaning that corresponds to something we're really familiar with. There is a very good chance that some people, perhaps even most people, may not pick up or respond to those structures at all. You know, I found that actually it felt so deliberate, and the three stories felt, because it was so successful at the end, everything that came before it felt necessary. You know, and I'm sure I could go back and say, was this as successful as that? And that's probably true. You know, maybe the second story wasn't as satisfying as the other two, but I think because I was so affected by the end, it made me feel that the rest of the dance had to be the way it was to get to that point. You know, so I really appreciated that. The other thing I would say is that I'm really interested I'm really interested in ways that you can escape from narrative, you know, and I think that's why I was so caught up in this film and so surprised by it. Because it's very daring. It's very daring to have, as you say, the only thing we know about this woman's home life is that very brief moment where we perhaps see her partner at the window. And so it forces you to ask the question, well, what is this film about then? And perhaps it's not kind of about anything but what you were saying, you know, about sensitizing yourself to gesture and coming back to that sense of, you know, value and meaning in just being, you know. And I didn't find it as cold as you. I see what you mean, that it's perhaps we're kind of the risk of not building on narrative in that way is that you don't relate to the characters in any sort of immediate obvious sense, and yet there is something, I don't know, I can relate to that quietude, that sitting on your own in your own flat and looking at the window, you know, that's powerfully intimate and private. And so actually the compassion that engendered in me was far more potent than it might have been if you know, I'd known all about her life. And I'm not saying that's what you wanted from the film, but I'm saying that this alternative kind of methodology I found just as powerful as anything else. So yeah, it seems like I enjoyed it perhaps a lot more than you. I think it was, I don't think it really missed a beat for me, apart from that title card at the beginning.
Yeah, well, I think I can really appreciate what you say about the risk in this film. And I think I do really appreciate that. And it is slightly odd, isn't it, that I've catalogued a series of criticisms, but I'm still saying that I enjoyed the film, and I did enjoy it. I've thought about it a few times since, and that's always a good sign, I think, when a film, you know, comes back to you after the event. Maybe I'm being harsh, you know, on picking up. It's not perfect, and you know, maybe you didn't need it to be perfect, and you know, you were just able to enjoy it as it was, and it is pretty good and successful. I do, you know, I've no doubt that this film succeeds at a lot of what it's trying to do. So you know, it's, I guess when we do these reviews, well, it's like with any crit of any work, you know, I'll always find things that I like about it and find things that I don't like. And I think it's always useful to, you know, I quite like hearing what people don't like about my work and what they, you know, the negative, that really helps me, you know, if it's constructive. I mean, obviously, you know, it has to be constructive. But I think maybe in terms of the review, I would like to emphasize that I appreciate that risk. And the risk probably means that the film isn't perfect. You know, it does take a risk. And in some ways it's maybe a little unkind to list so many problems with it, when in fact, it's, you know, I enjoyed it. I think, you know, in some ways, I think this film is about, you know, the thing I really enjoyed about this film was the, you know, the idea of the gesture that we're talking about, the idea of every gesture matters. And, you know, I just think that was fantastic. That was really good. It feels to me like this film is so overloaded with grief and sadness and loneliness that, you know, and mate, you know, but that's just a personal thing, because it's like I'm so fascinated by the gesture part of the story. But, you know, maybe I can understand that for the filmmaker, that you know, the grief is and sadness is critical to it. But I think that's the thing, that I love the gesture part of this film so much, and the movement and the dance, that it's so overloaded with grief for me, and sadness and loneliness and emptiness, that, you know, it slightly took something away from the experience. But I certainly would recommend this film. I certainly would, you know, commend this film, and I do think it's successful. To the extent I'm criticizing it, it's, you know, it's very constructive. I think it's a great piece of work.
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit of a sucker for grief and sadness and loneliness. I like all that, and I think it's a good point you make as well, because I did the opposite with this film. You know, I did pick up on the title card and a couple of other things that sort of threw me off a bit, but I tend to drop them because I tend to get swept up in my own rhetoric, and I can really like a film, and then by the time I finish making notes on it, I'm in love with this film. You know, but I did really enjoy it, and what I was thinking when you were talking just at the end there is that, if all one took away from this film was the film's ability to make us recognize the meaning inherent in every gesture, then that, if that's all we took away from the film, that's quite an accomplishment. You know, not many films have a takeaway as unusual and profound as that. So yeah, I suppose despite either of our reservations, it's definitely a notable film, isn't it?
Definitely, absolutely. So what's next?
Next up is a film called Malmkrog by Christy Puy.
It's a bit of a marathon.
It's a big one. Yeah.
All right, looking forward to it.
Go.